everybody, to our first speaker of the year for the CRLT Jacobs Speaker Series. I am delighted to see such a large crowd, especially as we are welcoming the first graduate of the Learning Sciences program, who also has a master's in instructional systems technology. So it is so wonderful. I wanted to open the series this year with a distinguished alumna from Indiana University School of Education, who has done very well and made us all proud, even though I wasn't really here, but I'll still claim. So Alyssa, we are so glad you're here. Alyssa is, let me not spend too long introducing her so she can get to her talk. So Alssya Wise is an associate professor of learning sciences and educational technology at New York University. Her PhD is in learning sciences from here, and her master's is in IST. And I did not know you had a bachelor's degree in chemistry. I would not have guessed. She serves as co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Learning Analytics, and her story of how she got into learning analytics is probably beyond the scope of the talk, but really interesting if you catch a moment. And her current research uses natural language processes, social network analysis, and predictive modeling techniques to extract meaning from student data and interpretive approaches to investigate the ways in which educational practices are being reshaped with the use of analytics. So with that, Alyssa, I'm going to turn it over to you, but thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Cindy. It's always a pleasure to get the opportunity to come out of the research context and share my work with other people, but it's especially special to get to come back here to IU to share work with all of you, though most people here were not here back in the day when I was around. But the place still feels the same, and it's wonderful to be back. And Cindy probably doesn't remember it, but the first time I met you was when I was in graduate school here. Tom Duffy, who was my advisor at the time, took me to lunch with you. And I think I was in my first year of graduate school, so there's no way you would remember, but it was during...
Where were we?
I think it was at ICLS in Santa Monica. About 2010, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. It's okay. This is what happens when you become the hotshot professor. You don't remember the first year doctor students?
No, I remember ICLS. So 2010 couldn't have been.
No, okay, it wasn't Sydney. 28? 2008?
2006.
2006? Yeah. Oh, God. Oh, my God. You're right. No, of course. It was 2006.
That's what happened. My whole family there who was texting me and telling me.
Right. No, 2010, I wasn't a grad student anymore. This is what happens to you when you do too many things at once. No, it was 2006. Anyway, I have very fond memories because Cindy, even back then, was very well known and esteemed, and it was a big, exciting moment for me. Anyway, enough about fond reminiscing. Let's talk about learning analytics. So I'm here to talk to you today about learning analytics and the learning sciences. How many of you are actually in the learning sciences kind of area? Okay, some people. Where's everyone else from?
Math Ed.
Math Ed?
Higher
IST, higher T? Okay, cool. So, language, all right. So we have a more diverse group, but I think a lot of the concerns for people coming from language ed and math ed and IST may be similar, maybe not IST. A lot of people in the learning sciences, I think there's been some concern about how do we start to bring analytics into our research in ways that does honor to the long tradition of caring about process, caring about context, caring about theory. And so what I want to do today is explain how I'm trying to push the field forward in ways where we can combine these new exciting advances and computational power with conceptual understanding in ways that both improve theory and also impact practice. Before diving in, it does take a village of researchers to get anything done, and I just want to acknowledge the many graduate students who are working with me on this project. So let me get started with a question, and it says the learning sciences, but if in your another field, you can substitute should math education, should language education, should higher education embrace learning analytics. The argument for is that learning analytics offer powerful methods for identifying patterns in large amount of data. I say from in tech-enhanced environments, but more and more we're collecting data from real-world classrooms. So it seems like an exciting way to look at much more data more quickly and in different ways than we ever could before. But are the methods appropriate and useful for generating deep insight into complex processes of learning? And there's some people who say, no, I don't think so. I think the computational methods take us too far away. What I would argue is learning analytics is still in its infancy, and we're still determining how these computational methods are going to be used. So instead of dismissing them out of hand and saying, I see work other people are doing and it seems sort of too far removed from teaching and learning to be useful for me, why don't we think about this question? Why don't we think about how these new computational methods could be useful to the things that we care about in our disciplines in ways that honor the values and traditions that we hold dear, and see where that can take us. So there's 3 key concerns. The first is that learning analytics is concerned with algorithmic processing over human insight. The second is that it's concerned with generalized structures over contextualized processes. And the third is that it's just a bunch of empirical findings and there's no theory building. So what I want to try and show you today through a couple of the projects I'm working on is how it's not either or, but both. How can we bring algorithmic processing and human insight together? How can we look at both generalized structures and contextualized processes? And how can we generate both empirical findings and make theoretical contributions? So for the first one, and this may be obvious to some of you, but learning analytics, machine learning, it's not magic. You don't have a bunch of data and a computer and you walk away and something happens. There's a ton of decisions that we're making about which data to include, how to put it into the system, what analysis approach we're going to do, which algorithm we're going to use to implement it with, how are we going to extract features from the data, and how we're going to set up the hyperparameters of the model. So I think the first acknowledgement is there's a lot of human decision making that goes into even the most computational approach. Second, this is the part where we put more responsibility on the computer, is we take these algorithms and we apply them to find patterns. But at the end of the day, figuring out what those patterns mean, we're still coming back to the human. So I think the claim that algorithmic approaches sort of take the human out of the equation are a little bit misleading. And so here, these are just a couple of the decisions that we've had to make, I think in the last week or so. Are we going to apply a clustering or a network analysis model to look at the data? How are we going to define what a tie in the network really means? What community detection method are we going to use? How does that establish what we mean by the notions of community? How are we going to choose what data to put in the first place? Another important thing to remember about applying algorithms is that we don't just have to use them in unsupervised ways. We can use them to extend at much greater scale work already done by humans. So some of the most exciting approaches, if you get reliable coding on a data set of a couple hundred student essays, you could then apply that equally reliability, if you have a good model, to a couple thousand. And so we're not trying to replace humans, but we're trying to extend. It's imagine you had sort of an army of graduate student robot coders who just work nonstop, never sleep. But I do think it's important to keep in mind that even with all of this, there is something very different when we as humans are interpreting the patterns that come out of an algorithm than when we as humans are acting as the instrument of interpretation. When we read student texts or we observe a classroom, we are going to see different things than a computer. And so it's not about replacement, but how do we bring them together? Another thing I want to talk about at the high level is this notion of generalized structures versus contextualized processes. So this, in some ways, I think learning analytics offers us a way to bridge the traditional qualitative-quantitative gap. So traditionally, quantitative methods focus on treatments and outcomes, while qualitative methods focus on the process of learning. But learning analytics is squarely looking at learning processes, just with quantitative data. In addition, quantitative methods have traditionally looked at regularities and patterns, whereas qualitative methods have focused on the nuances of specific contexts. Learning analytics does push more this way, but this is one area in which I'm working to bring us back, and you'll hopefully see that when I get to the example. And we go down and we look at generalized versus particular insights. Learning analytics actually is allowing us to look at scale at the nuances of many different contexts. It's both confirmatory and exploratory. And while there's some predetermined analysis, much of it is emergent. So there's a lot of ways in which learning analytics, even though it's using quantitative methods, actually follows a tradition that is in line with a lot of the assumptions of qualitative research. So I think it's an interesting way to start thinking about how do we start bringing qualitative back in. And one of the things that we've done is we've used learning analytics to help us figure out where to focus those qualitative efforts. When I have 500,000 student reflections, I can't start looking at them by hand unless I know where to start. And finally, I think the importance and the need to draw on theory is acknowledged. I was just having a conversation with Ben before now about the theory gap. I think this is an area in which more work is needed, which more work of people coming from the disciplines can bring to learning analytics. But it's also to remember these computational methods allow us to instantiate and test theory, and there's already some examples of how these methods are leading to new theory. So for this last one, we did a bunch of work looking at temporality, and there's all these methods that start to let us look at sequence patterns of how activities happen in a classroom. So for example, if somebody makes a contentious statement, how do other people respond? And what we found is a lot of our theories don't get that deep into temporality and the orders in which things should happen. And so by doing this analysis that wasn't possible before, we sort of revealed an area in which more theoretical work is needed. So what I want to do, and what I'm going to spend most of my talk on, is talking about a research project that we recently concluded that looks at MOOCs. This is not the point where you groan and say, oh my gosh, I don't care about MOOCs, and I'm going to leave. This is the part where you say, okay, she's going to actually make MOOC research interesting. I'm curious how that's going to happen. Right? So what we thought was interesting about MOOCs was we thought about them in this sort of model of archaeology. We have all these artifacts, all of these things that have happened in an online space, but instead of examining them as artifacts, we want to examine them as sort of representations of experiences of a culture, of something that actually happened. So we started with two premises. One, while all interactions in large-scale learning environments are not rich collaborative learning, that doesn't mean there isn't good stuff taking place somewhere in there. And secondly, one of the critiques, and I would agree with, problems in learning analytics is if you just throw everything into a bucket, it all gets mushed together and you can't find the interesting patterns. And so we said maybe what we need to do is look at this data differently. We need to understand what the discussion is being meant to do, and we need to segregate out. So we're only looking at the discussion that deals with the things we care about. In other words, if you have this large amount of things going on, it doesn't look like anything interesting is happening when you look at the whole. But you might look over here and actually there's some really cool conversation happening with one student helping a bunch of others. There might be a little community that's giving each other weekly support over here. I don't know, those people are doing good things too. So what did we do? We tried to get a hold of as much data as we could, not to analyze all of it, but so we could actually pick carefully what to look at. So one of the challenges of post-hoc data is what you can get a hold of. These weren't situations we designed. We didn't always even know about the context of learning. We had to make some inferences. We were able to do some research online to find out about these courses. But what we did was we limited the courses we looked at to ones in which the conversations in the online discussions were Q&A. So it's not a rich knowledge building discussion. It's a place where people go to get help. And this is because that's what a lot of them are used for. We also wanted to do increasingly distal generalization. So as you'll see, we picked which courses they were really specifically. And we also wanted to make sure we looked at variations in time because discussions in a course might happen differently from start to end. So the initial question we asked was, could we distinguish the conversations where students were actually talking about the content and maybe learning something with everything else? Because there's a lot of everything else. And can we do this with linguistic features? So what we wanted to do was build this model and then see, could we generalize it to another course, So we picked a statistics course. And you'll see in a second, it was a statistics course that was offered in 2013. And we got data from the same course offered 1 year later. Then we got data from another statistics course. Then we got data from a psychology course, and then data from a physiology course. So the idea was to try and see how far away the patterns of discussion held. And we also cared about, was it the same from the beginning to the end? So what did we do? We wanted to use these linguistic features to predict if a post that a student made was about learning the content. A really important decision that we made, and this is where I was referring to the decisions, is we took the unit of analysis as a thread. I've seen a lot of work looking at online conversations where they look at each comment in isolation of the other comments, and that's very concerning if we're trying to imagine these things as discussions. We initially just tried to determine if a thread was about learning stuff by looking at the first post, but later we extended it to all the posts that came afterwards. This is where we started off with real human coders, and they hand-coded a lot of posts. I'll check the numbers, but in the thousands. And we had a detailed coding guide. This is something you're probably familiar with if you've done sort of quantitative coding. We trained people, we got some good inter-rater reliability, but this was only a portion of all of our data. So that's when we went to the computational method. So we used a bag of words feature extraction, where we pulled out unigrams, single words, bigrams, word pairs, parts of speech, but they turned out to not be helpful, so we got rid of them. And this was another key decision point. So a standard thing when you do NLP is to eliminate all these things called stop words. And stop words are the words that sort of go between the meaning-carrying words. They're words like what and because and if, all the little words. And usually, if you're trying to figure out what something's about, they're not interesting. It turns out, for our work, and it took us a long time to figure this out, these were actually the most important words. So this is a real example of how the decisions you make in setting up your model become incredibly important. So we then used all of these words we extracted, I think about 2,000 of them, to create a linear regression model. We did a confusion matrix, we did tenfold cross-validation, and then we had the 4 test sets. We did some extra modeling to see whether other things would help. We looked to see whether the amount of time students viewed a post or how many times they voted for one would tell us if there was any learning going on. No, not at all. We tried modeling just those things, not helpful. And then we divided our test sets up based on beginning, middle, and end of the course. So we've got this model. How good was it? Is this going to work? No. OK. So this is what you can see that we started off with the course in 1 year, the following year, another stats course, psychology, physiology. You see the total number of posts, the number of threads. This shows you how many we coded, because this was testing the model. So we coded 800, 300, 300, 400, 300. It's a lot of coding. And this tells us what % of the discussions was actually about the course content. And that's actually really important to notice, right? So if all of these studies of MOOC learning have said there's not a lot going on, it might be because basically less than half of it is the stuff you wanted to look at in the first place. And I should add, this was just in the forums where it was supposed to be about learning. We already had taken out the ones that were supposed to be social and problems with the tech. This was in the place where the good stuff was supposed to happen. Less than half of it was in the first place. So how good was our model? Actually shockingly good even to us. So you can see we're getting accuracy of the computational model just based on the words of posts at a level of about 80% all the way through the stats courses, through the other stats course, through the psychology course, not the physiology course. And this is a bunch of statistics that just basically shows how good our recall and precision were. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but basically the model was really good until we hit the last course. Any guesses as to why that might be? Okay. So the normal answer I get is that people say, well, psychology, I can see kind of how they were using enough stats. Maybe it was similar kind of things they were talking about, but physiology, that's different. So we thought a possibility was physiology is learning about different things. It's difference in the content matter. But, yeah?
Could you just explain why a 7-point difference is significant?
A 7-point difference.
Sorry, 0.80 down to 0.7.
The top right cell compared to the rest of the row.
I wouldn't say it's significant in a statistical sense, but I would say that you can see our accuracy level stays constant at 80% and then drops.
And drop, okay.
Yeah, so I wouldn't claim it statistically significant, but I would say we're seeing quite a difference in accuracy, and it's a pretty large corpus that we're looking at. So it seemed worth looking further.
Okay.
And we did look across time, and that was good news. Basically, it didn't matter if the posts were in the beginning, middle, or end of the course. The model worked equally well. This is the part that I get excited about. So what were the words that were helping our model do this? This is the part where we start unpacking what the model's telling us. So what's interesting is we expect it to be a lot of words about statistics and psychology. That would explain why when we got to physiology it didn't work. But that little bit there, that small piece of the graph, that is the only part that related to the course subject. And this was like the top features, and we just grouped them by category. So those were all the words that had to do with the course subject. And this was about the top 100 features we pulled. Everything else that was making the model work was different. It was question words, connectors, can, does, why, how, which. These are the stop words I was talking about. It turned out that when people were discussing the content, they were using all of these little connector words to phrase interesting, useful questions. And when they were talking not about the content, they would say words like answer, exam, course, lecture, thank, good, I, and my. So it turned out, and this was really exciting, it didn't matter that it happened to be statistics, it mattered how they were talking about statistics. And so we went back and looked in depth at what was going on in the physiology course, and it turns out it wasn't actually the subject matter that made the model fail there. It was the fact that that course asked the students every week to relate what they were learning in the course to their own bodies. So there was lots of use of these words, and that's what made the model not work. So what I think is important here is a couple of things. One, we were able to get a model that we could use at scale, which means that we could start applying this to discussion forums, so you would actually only be able to look at the stuff that was about the course content, get rid of the other half of it, and suddenly, hopefully, you'd have everything that was relevant to you. Also, even though we expected it to be really domain specific, it turned out to be domain general in an interesting way. And third, we could understand why the model wasn't working on physiology, and it wasn't simply that, courses about the body are different than statistics. It had to do with the pedagogy and how it was being taught. We went back and we actually improved our classification using humans, and this was the part where I mentioned instead of just looking at the first post, then we looked at all the posts that came after. What I think is cool about this is we did a sort of a triage. So we asked the computer to calculate, do you think this discussion thread is about learning stuff or other stuff, based on the first post and based on all the other posts. And when the computer agreed with itself, which it did about 58 times, we said, great. But when the two computer metrics disappeared, we sent in the humans to figure out the difference. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but the notion is that even when we're setting up computational models, we can try and get at the same problem in two ways as sort of a method of triangulation, and then, again, triage our efforts as humans and only spend time looking in the middle. And this is just some ways in which that could be used to support students and instructors. We could only look at the content threads, which would reduce what people are spending time looking at. We could also do a live tagging tool that might remind students, if they're only posting about non-content things, how they could change that. It could be sort of a metacognitive prompt. We then said, okay, now that we can reliably, across thousands of posts, separate this, can we understand better how students are connecting with each other? And so we started to say, well, hey, we looked at all of the social network analysis out there, and it turns out people use all these different definitions to construct ties, and they mean really different things. So in some discussions, people say, okay, I'm only going to say you're connected to somebody if you actually reply to their post. This is a really sort of micro inference, and you're pretty certain that if I've replied to your post, I'm connected to it, but probably I'm connected to some other people in a discussion who I didn't directly reply to. On the other hand, some people will say, if we just participate in the same thread, then we must be connected. That works fine in small discussions, but in MOOCs where you have thousands of people, I don't think that holds. So we tried out all of these definitions to construct some social networks so we could, again, understand where's the good interaction happening in these MOOCs and what does it look like. So we looked at one of the courses in particular, and you can see there's a little more content than non-content. One thing we found that was interesting is there was a pretty even breakdown between students who participated in content discussions, non-content, and a little bit of both. So we created a whole bunch of network metrics, and this was mainly just to figure out which definition we wanted to use. And what you can see very clearly is the one on the right, which was the total co-presence that says everybody in a thread does the same thing, is giving us very different metrics. So that struck us as problematic, which it turns out if you look at the literature, about half the studies use. So I think that's a real caution to go back and look at what people have found previously. We then looked at the actual networks, which are pretty colored hairballs. And what you can see in the total co-presence is that this one thread here, let's see if we get it, that looks like it's kind of interesting and important, gets blown up here. And what this showed us is this one, again, it's very different. Something else is going on, but it was a good diagnostic because over here, you can see each one of these looks the same, but when we go here, it looks different. And it turns out that this thread that was started by U2 was a single post saying, hi, how's it going? And I think about 150 people replied once saying, I'm John, I'm taking this course because I want to learn more about statistics. So it was completely not interesting. It completely dominates the graph. It looks like something interesting. When we didn't separate it out, it dominated the graph. But when we get rid of it, we actually see, just looking at the content, there's some other things going on. to that one. And I'll tell you what those things are in one second, but I just want to point out we're going to dive into what we find qualitatively. So it's not just showing these patterns, but figuring out what they mean by identifying where to spend our qualitative time. And what we did is we identified communities and subnetworks worth looking at, and then we did stratified random sampling across thread length. So we looked at short threads and long threads, and we examined those posts manually, and we actually used a traditional qualitative thematic analysis to figure out what was going on. So this is the big difference we found. When you bother to separate out content and non-content, all that stuff that took us a long time to get to, you see really different things. You see here a lot of sort of hub and spoke networks with one person at the center, and these are not surprisingly, this is one of the instructors. This is that thread I mentioned that's just, you know, all the stuff that looks like it would be interesting, it's not. It's not at all. But when we get over here, we see much more density. We see things closer connected together, and we see there might be something else going on. This is even before we dive in. What do we see here? The node degree, which is how many other individuals somebody connected with. It's a little bit higher for content, but not so much. But the number of times they reconnected with somebody is different. And so that's exciting because when we're talking about these conversations, we want people to reconnect with each other more times. So when we looked at the actual threads, what did we find? The content interactions had larger threads with the people participating more than once. They included more complex topics and interaction techniques, and they used more social presence cues. Ironically, what we found was the content-based conversations were actually really social. So the interesting sociality where people actually built connections as opposed to just said, hi, my name's Joe, that was with the content that was involved. We were also able to extract groups of learners that talked to each other multiple times. And you can see there's real differences. So in the non-content networks, people who were connected as a module, they're kind of strung out. There's not a lot of repeat connections. But here we see a rich network of about 5 or 6 core people who interacted again and again and again. And you can see that where their average edge weight is just through the roof. So what happened there? We looked at this thread, and what we found was throughout the entire course, this was a little mini community that were supporting themselves through every assignment, giving each other help. And they get to the end, and they just say, you know, the test was scary. I thought of you guys often. You guys helped me so much. I was always a few days behind. I was glad I was able to catch up in the last weeks and participate a bit. There was this sense of social obligation. And so what we see is even in these large forums, there are these little communities who are finding each other and helping each other out. We also saw some really interesting things, differences in how the 2 instructors participated. So for now, we'll just focus on the content, because that's kind of what I'm more interested in. And you can see again, one instructor had kind of the starburst pattern, where it seems like they're connected to people, but the students aren't connected to each other. And this one has a much denser connections between students around the nodes. And you can see that in terms of the average edge weight and also the average node degree being higher. And it turns out there's a really clear reason for that. The first instructor gave responses at all levels, was coaching and supporting their students, and used social presence cues. So they would say messages like, think about it again using the hints and let me know if you have any questions. That's correct, nice. So how would you solve the question? Kinds of things we would kind of hope an instructor's doing. The other instructor was very prompt in giving answers, but always shut down discussion and said, a bell shape's not necessary, you could have had a bimodal distribution. Straightforward answers, nothing social. And you can decide for a given course, maybe that's okay, but the fact that these very different kinds of answers led students to respond in very different ways, and ways that we could detect computationally, I think is really powerful if we want to understand what's going on across courses. Let me just see where we're at in time. So the last thing we investigated in the MOOCology study that I think is important to point out is that people have really questioned what's going on with online discussions and do they connect to learning. And there's very inconsistent findings. People don't really talk so much about the percent of variance. They just say people who participated in more discussions did better. It's pretty weak, basically. And there's no consideration of what they talked about in the discussion. So I wouldn't think that just participating in a discussion would really do much. And so we asked, what's the relationship between all of these things we see going on that look like learning and actual outcome measures? It's, again, the same course. So we found an interesting distinction. Making any kind of form contribution makes you more likely to pass the course. Participating in both content and non-content makes you even more likely to pass the course. So there's sort of an engagement piece. Now, this is correlational, so it just might be that people who are more engaged are also participating. But what we found that was interesting was that only contributing to the content discussions was associated with a higher grade, which is exciting because it shows that distinguishing content and non-content gives us a better signal, but the percentage of variance was very small. It was still less than 5%. So what's going on? There's a couple of implications. One, forum participation's cool but has no impact on learning, which would suggest we need to design these things better, which I would argue we do. Two, forum participation is useful but not measured very well. Maybe we need to assess the quality of contribution better. Maybe we need to assess who's paying attention to what. Or three, which is kind of where I'm standing right now, the type of learning that's occurring in these forums is not well captured by grades. I think the value of the forums is people participating differently over time. It's people coming to competence in a domain. It's not the same thing as just doing better on the test. So we think there's something missing. And so people have started to say maybe we need to look for learning in the MOOC context elsewhere. In particular, where people contribute to the real world. And maybe we need better measures of learning in this MOOC context that's happening out in the world, not in the confines of a university that people are taking for all sorts of reasons, to understand what they're doing with it after. Are people who are taking a coding course making more contributions to GitHub later? Are people who are taking a data science one trying to publish in data science later? So at the end of the day, this is one example of how we're making very explicit decisions about our computational choices. We're trying to bring machines and humans together in collaboration for coding. And we do extensive manual follow-up of anything we find. I think the biggest danger in learning analytics is you find a cool social network pattern, you make a pretty graph, and that's the end. I mean, I've seen a lot of studies like that. And I think that's really dangerous because when you look under the hood, sometimes you'll find a deeper explanation for your pattern. Sometimes you'll find your pattern didn't hold. We did a cluster analysis back in, I think, 2009, and when we went back to look at the factors contributing to it, what we found was the overall statistics were hiding what was going on. And so we need to start there but not end there. Again, by going back to the data to understand how the model was doing the predictions, we learned a lot more about what was important. And again, we followed up on these communities to see what was going on. We've been considering different contributions to theory. What does it mean to have a tie in a discussion? And I would say we need to reconceptualize theories of learning in MOOC because we're not going to find connections between discussion forums and traditional grades the way it's happening. So to wrap up this part, these are some principles that I proposed at ICLS in London. And I would say it says principles for learning sciences aware learning analytics, but it's more broadly principles for an educationally aware learning analytics. We need to ground our analyses in theory. We need to be characterizing our context richly. That was a challenge here because we didn't know it as well as we could have. We need to justify what data we're choosing and the features we put into our models. We need to make sense of high-level patterns using low-level data. We need to present the analytical results not just connected to static states, but the processes that generated them. We need to think about the scope and boundaries of applicability, and we need to consider the theoretical implications. So what I want to do for the last 15 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to chat, is I wanted to just overview two other projects. So this is one we were doing for a long time, and there's lots of beautiful results. But there's two new projects that we've started recently that I think are very exciting, and they're under development. And it's actually the first time that I'm presenting on them. We have a couple papers in. So I wanted to share those with you, and just so you can see some of the ways in which we're applying these same principles to new contexts. Oh, those are lots of references. So one of them is a project that we're calling Mirror Mirror. And I was mentioning this earlier. Many students in the health professions, medical, dental, nursing, there's a long tradition of reflective practice. And so these students are asked to reflect all the time about what they're learning, where their areas of strength are, what they need to work on. But for the most part, sadly, not only are these not read and given feedback, no one's even looking at them. And so we said, how can we start to look at them? And they said, well, there's 100,000 of them. I said, okay, maybe we'll start with some computational methods and figure out where to look. So what we want to do, and to be fair, this was not a project that started with a clear mission. It was a project that started with the Dent School saying, we have 500,000 student reflections from the last 5 years Faculty don't have enough time to read them. We need to know when students are in trouble. We need to know how can we change our curriculum. We want to know what people are learning. So we've just started to do this. Some of the things we're thinking about is professional education, both as a process of coming to know and coming to be, and thinking about how identity is wrapped up in this. Prior evaluation of reflections have just looked on depth and level, like how deeply they reflect, and we think that's not very useful. So we're looking at components. What aspects of reflection are they considering? And the last one is about their domain understanding. People have done topic modeling, which just kind of gives you these big buckets of words, and we wanted to look at how students are connecting different concepts together and how that changes over time. So we started off doing this elaborate mapping of anyone who'd looked at reflections in health professions, and what we found was, there's sort of these different components that we can align with conceptual categories, and then people have done studies and come up with this really long list of linguistic features that you can use to predict them. But all that tells you is, are people being descriptive or not? Are they being analytical or not? And that didn't get us where we wanted to go. So we struck some new ground. Let me tell you a bit about the data, and then you'll see what we're working on. So this is what the system looks like. They're asked to do 6 reflective statements at the start and end of every year, 134 course reflections whenever they finish the course, and then there's 47 competencies and 48 knowledge inventory items they're supposed to complete annually. A lot of reflection. And we know they do every single one very thoughtfully. So I take a different approach than many people in learning analytics. I didn't start by saying, let's look at all 500,000. I actually wanted to look at a really small piece of the data so I could feel like I had some sense of what I was looking at. So the graduating year 2000 and X, because we don't want to know who they are exactly, we took 2 of 15 cohorts. Each cohort's about 25 to 30 students. They have the same courses, the same instructors, and they run about 15 of these at a time because there's about 250 students a year. So we gathered all of the reflective statements from those students, and again, there was too many. A lot of them were duplicative. So we said, let's start at the basis, just looking at the very first one they do when they enter dental school, or whenever in the first semester they complete it, and then the very last one they do. So we really scaled down the number we looked at right away because we wanted to be able to follow qualitatively in a meaningful way. So we had a total of about 500 reflections for the students from Group A and Group B at the beginning and the end. And we made some network graphs, and you can see they're big hairballs, right? Not very useful. But even the hairballs actually tell us something. So what we can see is there's actually a big difference between these two groups in how many reflections they did, how long they did. We see a big difference in the unique words they used. So there was a difference in vocabulary. But what's interesting is what happened here at the beginning doesn't seem to have continued, right? We see this group grew massively in the number of unique words they used, the length of their reflections, and most importantly, in their connections. So it seems like they're actually connecting concepts together in a way we see a little less of for this group. So we wanted to dive in a bit more. So we started pulling just sort of top words as a way to get in at this. And what you can see is a lot of the concepts are the same. And that's good. We would hope that people are mentioning that they will be a professional who treats patients as they become a good dentist, right? Those are good things. But we actually also saw some interesting differences. So in Group A, we saw these words about they want to learn and work. And you can just see this is the frequency of those words in the other group. And this group's talking about they, hope, skill, and year. And so then we started to go and follow up on each one of these words. And I'm just going to show you one as an example. And it was the word skill. So when we look at the word skill in the first group, we see they want to learn and use their knowledge, whereas this group is talking about they hope to develop and gain and improve. We had a suspicion there was something different there, but it wasn't until we went back and looked at the qualitative data that it came really clear. This group talks about, I want to learn and get the knowledge and skills and go on and use them. And this group says, I know that professionals need to develop the necessary interpersonal skills. This was year 1. By year 4, we actually see the same thing going on, whereas this group says, yep, those skills I wanted to learn, I did it. I got them. We're good. And this group talks about how I want to continue to develop my communication skills in order to effectively treat patients. This is something that we would have never found just reading through the reflections, but this signal of showing the different frequencies of words led us to look for that. So this is interesting. We have not yet shown this data to the dental school because I want to be very careful. I don't want the takeaway to be this group learned better than this group. I mean, there's a lot of factors that could have contributed, so we need to think about what to do with it. But the idea that there's something different happening and that group came in with a different orientation and they came out with a different one, I think is important and interesting. One of the things that I'm most excited about is this. We wanted to take those big hairballs and just prune them down. So we pruned a lot. You could prune less than this, but we started off pruning them down to just the top 10 connections between concepts. And what you can see, this is the two groups, this is group A at the start, group B at the start, and the two groups at the end. What can you see just by looking at them immediately?
They converge a little bit.
Yeah, so we have all these disconnected components, and then we've got one big connected component. What else?
Suddenly have green circles.
We have some green circles. Yeah, so the green circles represent new words that appeared. And you can actually see here we've got the words about feel and treat versus the words about provide good. The thing that jumped out at me was that, yes, the word patient appeared in the start of both, but here, the patient's right at the middle. And there's a lot of talk in health education about patient-centered care. So I'm seeing a clear signal that these students are moving to a model of patient-centered care that was not strongly evident at the start. So what we're seeing is their understanding of what it means to be a dentist is becoming more integrated, and it's becoming more patient-centered. And I think I have the quote, yeah. So the students actually talked about this. We went back and looked, and they said, I wanted to be an excellent healthcare provider for my patients, but I didn't really get what that meant till I actually had their oral health needs in my hands. And so the next thing we're starting to do now is go back and look, not just at the beginning, at the end, but at the end of each year and try and see, is it really true that the big shift in conception happens when they go from year 2 in the classroom to year 3 in the clinic? Or is it happening progressively along the way? How does this understanding change and evolve over time? We also saw some interesting subtle shifts in signs of identity. So one word that didn't appear at all at the start that showed up by the end was the word clinician. And it was used often in trigrams as a clinician, like a clinician. And they would say things like, I've grown, I've learned to think like a clinician. So there was this sense of starting to see themselves, not just as someone studying dentistry, but being a dentist. And they often moved from the word I to the word we. And so again, this may be a subtle sign of starting to feel like you are a member of the dental profession. I would be really curious to also study this with dentists after they get out into residency and field, but I don't know if the reflections are collected in quite the same way. So that's just a taste of what we're starting to do there. It's a small sample. I don't want to make big conclusions, but I think the methods are presenting interesting ways to look at how students connect ideas together, thinking about their schema of their emerging field. The very last project I want to talk briefly about is what happens when we take all this stuff and we put it back into practice. So at NYU, our instructional technology department has built a dashboard for instructors. And it shows them what students look at what, how they do on pre-class tests, all this kind of stuff. But no one had really looked at what happens when you put that in an instructor's hands. So I would say we know very little about how teachers in general, but particularly university instructors, most of the good studies have been done at the K-12 level, and that we need to study this use in situ, even if the tools are imperfect. Otherwise, we're going to be optimizing tools to the non-existent context of a lab. And in fact, there's a nice paper that was out by Simon Buckingham, Shun, and Kirsty Kiddo recently called Embracing Imperfection in Learning Analytics. And I think we definitely want tools to get better, but the notion they're going to ever be so perfect that there's no problems is a bit mythical. And so how do we get teachers and educational professionals to work with tools that are going to have a degree of uncertainty, that are going to have problems? And so we're hoping to both inform theoretical models of thinking with data and also supports for how to do that. Everyone I show this to says, oh great, so how did you redesign the dashboard? Yes, you can redesign the dashboard, but that's not our point. Our point is how do you support people in using the dashboard? And so what we've done just from the first study is we did interviews with the instructors who used this for the course of a semester, and it helped us move from a pretty simple model of how they worked with the analytics to see that they don't always have questions, but they interpret the data with their knowledge of the classroom. They're always trying to triangulate data in the analytics with something out. We never saw somebody feel confident with the analytics if it didn't match something they'd seen outside the tool. They're always looking for reference points to try and understand, okay, is this a lot, is this a little, what do I compare it to? They often felt adrift because they hadn't seen the analytics before. A lot of them wanted to see a whole term of analytics before they'd go back and make decisions about what to do in week 1. So one thing we're considering for the next rollout is getting their prior year data to show them as a starting point before they look at the current year data. They talked a lot about how they might take action, but they didn't mostly do that. The kinds of actions they talked about were mostly whole class scaffolding. They seemed to feel quite hesitant to want to go talk to a student based on the analytics, but they felt fine talking to the group. And there was talks of course design as well. The biggest thing we saw was this wait and see. Everyone said, it's really interesting, but I'm going to wait and see. And we're curious to see in the second cycle that's happening now, are people more willing to take action, or is that hesitancy still there? We also saw some really cool reflection on pedagogy where people were really challenged about how they thought about participation, or they would see that people who were really active in their class were not doing anything online, and they had these big question marks. And so there was one professor who sort of said, I need to really rethink what I'm requiring of my students and why. We also saw some interesting things about what I would call the challenges of deficit perspective. People were using the analytics always to look at what's not happening. There was no, let's commend these people for doing well, or this group is in the middle, they just need a little push to get higher. It was always looking at the bottom. And I get why that's important, but I think that we can't only look at the bottom. The role of analytics as evidence was really interesting. The extent to which people took the evidence of the analytics as truth versus what students might describe. The extent to which they wanted to show the analytics sort of as proof of something, I think is also something we have to be concerned with. There was also quite a few emotional reactions. Pretty much universally, the analytics showed that students were not doing as much as the professors thought. This was true for professors who thought they were doing everything, and this is true for professors who thought they had a realistic assumption of what was happening. And so I think we need to really think about how do we mesh those. One professor felt particularly powerless, sort of saying, I put so much effort into this. They're not looking at it, they're looking at the night before. There was really a sort of, I'm going to tell them again that it's important. What do I do? And so that sort of powerlessness is a big problem. That's not what we want to induce. And so what we've started to do is, we can't control the analytics. I'm not in charge of that, but I can help support them. So we've actually hired someone whose job is to be a pedagogical analytics coach. And right now he's writing weekly emails. So instead of getting an email that says, here's your analytics for the week, click on the blue dot to see what it means, it says, here's your analytics for the week. Are you worried your students aren't reading the things you need them to read for your classroom discussion? What should you do about it? And it has some pretty common advice that we may all know, like let your students know why it's important and that they're going to use it in class, but that's not always being communicated. So it's really trying to tie the pedagogy to desired actions and to the analytic results. So I think I will stop there. It's a lot of things. I just wanted to mention, so NYU Learned is the new learning analytics research network that I'm directing at NYU. And the goal of this network is to have learning analytics that are making research contributions, but also affecting practice in the university at the same time. So we're trying to build up partnerships with faculty members, with instructional technologists, with data sciences, professors, to get everyone working together. And it's an exciting and challenging time at the university. And if you want to hear more about that, we can chat. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions before pizza on the balcony.
Have you published anything on the dashboard work yet?
We just finished writing up the dashboard paper 2 days ago, and it's in review. I can share it with you if you would like.
Thank you.
Yeah, just ask it.
Okay. I have more questions. What are some of the studies that have been done on K-12 dashboards that you would say are well done? Like you mentioned that most of the stuff in that area was done in K-12.
Yeah, so Jennifer Palin in Singapore and Inga Molinar in the Netherlands have both done classroom studies of teachers using dashboards at the K-12 level, and Anushka Van Leeuwen has done it in simulated settings for collaborative learning, I think also K-12, but it was not actual classrooms.
The second person was Molinar?
Molinar, yeah.
Sarah and then Kurt.
I'm wondering if you can talk about how learning analytics relates to informatics. Informatics is a huge push on this campus, but I'm still trying to figure out what it is. Is learning analytics kind of an informatics with a learning focus?
Well, I guess partly I'd want to know what you mean by informatics.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, learning analytics is about, taking advantage of all the data that's out there and collecting new useful data to understand teaching and learning. I mean, informatics, I would imagine, is quite a bit more broad because you could be collecting data for a lot of other purposes. I mean, learning analytics is really focused on supporting the teaching and learning process and feeding that data back into the process while the process is still ongoing. And to me, informatics could be a lot of things, but I'd have to know how it's being used here.
And when you do this work, you're doing the coding? Like, is that part of what you do?
Yeah.
So you're doing the coding and then you're interpreting what's coming out.
Yeah, so we're getting the data, we're creating the models to process it, we're making sense of what it means, and we haven't gotten there yet, but in the long term, we're going to hire people to build up systems so that the data processing could be happening in real time and be interpreted by others, right? Ideally, we want to take ourselves out of the interpretation step and let the instructors do it themselves. But there's a lot of reasons that I don't want to jump to that until we're sure what the data is saying, that we can show it in ways and support the interpretation in valid ways. And I think there's a lot of potential for it to be used in ways we don't want, so I guess I'm a little cautious about jumping there.
So I have two questions for you, Alyssa. Great to have you here again.
Hey.
Impressed. You seem to downplay the content discussions a bit, and you said you stripped out the social side, and yet the content-focused discussions were 28 to 54% really content-focused. At least the numbers that you had presented there. A couple decades ago, I worked with the Army Research Institute, and we coded thousands of discussion forums and whatnot, and they found 30% of the discussion was social, and the generals were happy because that's what happened in the face-to-face class. They liked the social was important for the content side, for the cognitive side of things. I'm curious. You stripped out. Can you tell us a little more of what you stripped out and what you actually found there? And
yeah, so we didn't strip out the social. I would agree with you. The social is super important for the content. That's what we found. What we did was we said there's lots of things that can happen in the discussion that are valuable, but I want to understand the interaction that's happening around the content, which could also be social. But the things where they're only saying, I'm here because I'm excited about the course, that don't get into the content at all, or the things where they're saying I can't access the test, that we didn't want to look at. And part of it is there's just too much, so you have to find some way to narrow what you're looking at. And we thought that if we care about learning, looking at conversations where they're discussing the actual course material is a good place to start. No, but I've been questioned. I've been questioned on this many times, people, and I agree with you. The social is important, but we thought let's start with where people are talking about the course content, and it turns out we found there's lots of social there. And this reminds me back, I think, some findings from George Koo from like 1,000 years ago that said that sociality on campus, students were more likely to stay connected to a university if their sociality was connected with academics. So in other words, if their social circle was around studying for math, that had more benefit for retention than if their sociality was just about hanging out at a frat. So this to me seems kind of similar.
Mm-hmm. Right. The second question is, you mentioned right after that and had the chart up there showing the words can, does, why, how, which, that were relationship words or connecting words that were in effect providing more rich synthesis of what had transpired. And that kind of reminds me of 20, 30 years ago, the difference between substantive facilitation and procedural facilitation. We'll talk about that later when we meet. But I'm curious, do you see that being operationalized, that might be an implication of something you can teach with instructors, how to build those kinds of generic, I'll call them procedural facilitators, teach the words. Can we teach those words to get more rich discussion for?
I would say yes, but I wouldn't focus on teaching the words. I would focus on teaching the kind of question and then use the words as sort of the indicators to get there.
Okay, Elizabeth, I think you had, Gamza? I'm just trying to, there were all of a sudden lots of hands went up.
I have a question. It was very interesting, like in terms of learning, using data learner analytics and then doing the empirical findings and coming to the theoretical contributions. When you presented the study about the dental school reflections, there are so many reflections and the professors didn't have enough time. So you kind of provided the service of an insight of what's going on this cohort and what's going on this cohort. So like this was a very practical use for the professors teaching that class. So what other contributions, like in a case like that, we can bring in the dental word? We can say the field is going more clinical oriented, or patient care is somewhat more emphasized in orientation, so we can see in the reflection. But it looks like a black box, almost like we don't know what's going on further than this is what we see in the representation versus this what we saw. So what type of implications we can bring, or what other data sources we can support?
Well, so I think one of the challenges we're facing with the dental data is that everything we want to do with the linguistic models needs lots of data. So we actually are building up a conditional word embedding model, but in order to build that model, we need to use all 500,000, which is exciting because it tells you something about the corpus, but it's not useful for what we're saying. Even here, using the cohort, I'm a little worried because I would like to be able to see an individual student's conceptions, but you can't build a social network with a very small amount of data. So we sort of are facing a challenge there. I think imagining that there's tons of these cohorts going through, looking across them can be very interesting. It would be nice if we could see where the patient-centeredness is supposed to happen, and then we could see, oh, real time, maybe it's not happening here. Another thing we saw for that cohort was they talked about feelings a lot, and that's something that we found in the literature, is that feelings are often not emphasized in reflections enough, but they're considered important. They're worried that there's too much thinking about the patient, but not empathizing with them. So that's another thing. We haven't figured out how do you use this to detect who to talk to, and we don't want to make early detection. So right now it is retrospective. And those are things that we're working on. The other thing that the dental school really wants to do that we're exploring is looking at the course reflections to try to remap their curriculum, which is a design thing. So that could happen retrospectively. So they want to see, where do the courses overlap? Where do courses teach the same concepts but connected to different things? Where are there gaps, concepts they think are important but aren't showing up anywhere? And they're under a mandate to reduce their curriculum by 10%, so that's quite pressing. Yeah, but it's not simple to just say, okay, now we do this.
Just real quickly, I don't know if you can go back to the last slide in your dental education study.
This one?
Yeah, that is the one. So this is all really interesting. Thank you for your talk. A lot of it, I don't know the techniques, so I'm sort of trying to fill in. But the part that had me sort of most skeptical was in this inference where you have these discussions.
These weren't discussions. These were individual reflections. These ones.
Pardon me, reflections. And they revolve around the word patient, or the word patient plays a central role in the reflections. It seemed like a big leap to call that a transition to patient-centered care. And I wanted to know a little more about that, because I mean they can be talking about patients, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's patient-centered care.
Yeah, so. I think that's fair, and that's something that's reasonable to be skeptical of. And again, these are students, so they're not out there. So we can't make any claim they're actually practicing patient-centered care. What I think we can claim based on this is that so a couple of things. The weight of the lines is how well they're connected, how tightly they're connected to a word. And each of these words, without getting too deep into the processing, there was lemmatization. So it might represent a bunch of similar words. So patient actually represents patient and patients and variants on it. And the size of the node represents the number of times, what was it with overall degree, the number of different words it was connected to, not just in this, but in the whole network. So what I think you can see here, for sure, is that the importance of patient is becoming much greater, and that patient is becoming the concept that ties everything else together. So does that align with patient-centered care as the way we think about treating the whole patient? Probably not. So maybe I need to scale back the language on that, but I think it definitely shows, and we can see in the language, they all start off talking about how excited they are, they want to be a dentist, and they want to be a professional, and they want to work as a dentist, and it's really about them. And there is somewhat of a shift to thinking about their patients first, and particularly here, thinking about how to treat their patients, how their patients feel. And so maybe we need to figure out how to better provide evidence for it, but I do think it's showing a real shift in how they're thinking about what it means to be a dentist and about it being about the patient versus just themselves.
But their training moves them in that direction too, right?
Their,
Okay.
yeah, their training and particularly I think the clinical experiences when they start interacting with patients.
Right.
This side, and try to keep track. And then I think it'll be time to go for lunch.
Can I go back to my original question? I'm just
Yeah.
curious, like, in terms of the model, how do you decide, like,
How do you decide what's good enough?
yeah, well, or, I mean, yeah. How in this context do you decide that 0.07 is worth going and looking at? And then, I guess, I'm not in learning sciences, but I am trying to figure out what's going on. A follow-up question to that is, the model doesn't...
We only have time for one question now,
Oh.
because we have one more, and then
All right.
just
I mean, I think, I don't think it's just that one number. I think that was just how I was illustrating the drop. You could also see, so kappa is the accuracy adjusted through base rate, and it tells you how, sort of how much better the chance is, and we see the drop off there. We see the recall, which is the number of threads related to content it can identify, drop from things that are in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, down to 60%. I mean, all of it is sort of, when you say how good is good enough, if I'm gonna run a model, what does this produce for my results? To me, these ones are clearly all okay. That one was showing something different. It was also the farthest away, so I was interested to know why it wasn't working. Not necessarily to say it wasn't good enough, but once we understand why, we could tweak the model, and that's, we could, change and say for that model, we don't want to use personal pronouns because the course was asking them to do that. So part of it's about model optimization rather than judging good or bad and trying to sort of probe why the models are working and what can we do to improve them, because the goal is to get a better model.
And of course, I have to ask a linguistic
Okay.
question.
And
To what
it's
degree-
the last
And it's the
question,
last
and then we can
question, I'll
talk a
try to
bunch.
word it very quickly. To what degree were you looking at raw word frequency versus collocational frequency? In other words, words that tend to come to cluster together. And then, of course, there are the pronouns to which they refer, and did you look at those referential meanings? I put in
When
three
you say
questions.
cluster, when you say cluster, you mean appear together, not cluster in the sense of cluster analysis, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So this study was using a bag of words model, which means all the words were as if they were thrown into a bag, so the relational bit didn't matter at all. But when we looked at which words were used together, that was what produced this. So this was about co-location. So these were words that were consistently used together. And I should point out, this is another decision point that we're still investigating. We said if two words appear in the same sentence, we're going to create a tie between them. But you could define it other ways. You could say for a word to be related to another word, it has to appear within two words of it in the sentence. Because I could have a really long sentence and the words at the end don't connect to the words at the start. Or we could say the entire reflection unit puts two words together. So how you define what counts as connected and how connected things have to be to count. These are just the top 10 connections because we had to start somewhere. We originally wanted to say the top 5% of connections, but that didn't work across. And so it's not that the decisions are arbitrary, but at the same time, there's not usually a hard and fast guideline, and you have to understand how the decisions relate to your data set. So it's one of the crafts of the field versus it being sort of this is how it's always done.
Well, thank you, Alyssa. Let's